So the first round of the 2014 Formula One World Championship is in the books, and it was an interesting race from start to finish and then beyond in the 2014 Australian Grand Prix. Will Vincent and Nick Rowland, we're going to break down everything that happened around the historic Albert Park circuit in this, it's just a Grand Prix podcast. And Nick, we really did have everything in Australia. We had rain in qualifying, we had people worrying about reliability, we had a pretty interesting race, and then as always, when you need to get that final controversial moment, you get something sorted out in the steward stand afterwards.
Exactly. We got absolutely everything today. In terms of the actual race itself, maybe not the most greatest of spectacles other than maybe the first few laps, but it was certainly an interesting one going into a new era of Formula One.
A new era of Formula One in many ways, and let's not forget, the last Formula One race to run a turbocharged engine was in Australia back in 1988 at Adelaide.
Certainly was, yeah. You kick off back where they finish, but this time obviously around Melbourne. And well, I think a lot of people have had to say a lot about the sounds. But the sounds, I think Martin Brunner put it quite well. The tone's okay, it's just not loud enough.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot as far as the actual cars go for 2014. You've got many people calling the cars ugly. I'll be honest, some of the cars are incredibly ugly this year. Some of the cars have actually made a bit of an effort in making their cars look nicer than they possibly could. But in many ways, I always think about the new Formula One cars 2014. And I think back over the last 10 years or so, back in 2001, we had those weird wings, and I always remember the Renault one was the ugliest of that, the Benetton as it was back in the day. Then you think around to about 2008, 2009, with all the diffusers, and people said that looked ugly. And then on the other side of the pond, in IndyCar, when the DW12 came out, everyone said that was ugly. But you grow used to it.
You do. I think the one thing obviously came out on Friday was that the FIA and the teams all agreed that there would be a review of the regulations, so it's unlikely we will see these types of noses again going forwards into 2015, but we have gone from this year. And you're right, some cars don't look too bad, and then you get a Caterham.
Yeah, the Caterham, I think it's the most interesting interpretation of that, and you can really see why the FIA have decided that they are going to do a review for 2015, because Kobayashi, the first corner of his return back to Formula One, that incident could have been a lot worse, and everyone is looking to see just how safe these, how do I say it nicely, protruding front noses, how safe they are in racing situations, because crash tests, it's just one car hitting a wall, not another car hitting another car.
Yeah, you do have to wonder just how safe they actually are and actually will be throughout the season. Didn't look too good though at the start. I think from we're a good few hours after the race now. I think it's been well documented that Kobayashi actually had a problem also with the car itself under braking. Obviously, this fly-by-wire system that they're using now, or brake-by-wire system that they're using, is still teams still learning and understanding. I remember throughout pre-season, Sauber had numerous problems with it, and it still seems like teams are struggling with it. Namely, Kimi Räikkönen, by the looks of it, he hates it. But in terms of actual noses, we also saw Jenson Button actually take part of the nose off in his pit stop. So you got to wonder, considering it came off that easily, how good is it in the crash test?
Yeah, and I saw a couple of people joke on Twitter a little bit after the race where he did something that a male would do if they're part of a certain religion or live in a certain area at a certain age. So a number of jokes came out of the McLaren camp after the race. But we'll go back to qualifying, because qualifying itself was incredibly interesting, with Vettel, of course, not making it through to Q3 for the first time in God knows how long. That was the big story. But also, Ricciardo in that Red Bull was able to really show that he is a good all-round driver, and in the same way that Button always used to shine in the wet, he always used to have Alonso, Raikkonen shining in the wet, he had Ricciardo, his first Grand Prix, in a Red Bull, in tricky conditions, really being the only person to take it to the Mercedes.
There has to be some sort of irony if Vettel actually has the car that breaks down all the time this season, but it's another Australian that has a car that's actually good. there's got to be some sort of irony within that if that does happen. But Ricciardo did a spectacular job with the machinery that he's been given. Clearly adapted to it absolutely fine. Considering that he has had a couple of years in Formula One now, and Vettel has all his championships behind him. He drove in Toro Rosso as well. But in terms of adapting to the car, Ricciardo seems to have taken to it very, very well. I think Vettel has done in pre-season testing. He did do over the weekends. But I think Ricciardo just seemed to dial into it much, much faster. And I think it's amazing to see how these younger drivers are dialing into the cars faster. Where everyone said, it'll be experience that prevails, and the older heads that prevail. But you got to remember, you put someone new into the car that doesn't know a car, and they're only going to learn that car. All the experienced drivers are going to remember the past few generations of car. So, in terms of this iteration, you drop a new driver in, such as someone like Kevin Magnussen, and look what happens.
And you talk about that, and again, outside of Formula One, Anna McNish is a perfect example of, Audi bringing out a new car which was completely different in the WEC and that build up to Le Mans. And he said, okay, it's time for me to call it a day because I don't think I can adapt to this new way of driving. And you have a couple of drivers in Formula One right now, some of the older drivers, when you are thinking, actually, it's going to become more and more difficult for them, in the same way that Damon Hill in the back end of his career, when they went from the big fat slicks to the skinny groove tyres, 98 and 99, he had issues. There's been a couple of other drivers as well. Jacques Villeneuve immediately pops to mind. And again, in different situations, you had Montoya, who had to go from those big, heavy champ cars to running in Formula One. Some people just don't adjust to it well. And there are a couple of drivers, and I'm going to pick on Raikkonen a little bit here. And I think he's the toughest candidate for that, because he doesn't like simulator driving. He just likes to get out and drive the car. Who is going to struggle?
In terms of the modern era, yes. I mean, drivers like to sit in the car, understand the car, and drive it. So I suspect this weekend has been a tremendous learning curve for the older type of driver that prefer to sit in the car and actually drive it. But Kevin Magnussen was asked in the qualifying session, has the simulator work helped? Clearly, it has helped. And, Daniel Ricciardo is another driver that has come through a sort of a simulator route, if you like, through testing and practicing, and obviously being with Toro Rosso and using the Red Bull facilities, and that's been able to go through the simulator route and understand the car and, all the tricks and trades with it on the steering wheel in particular. So, we know sim racing. We're involved in sim racing. We know how sim racing and real life racing are blurring the lines. Nissan are doing that as a prime example. So is iRacing. But the more and more you do it, and the more that these younger drivers are able to learn cars in simulators before they get onto the track, it's actually going to show that it is possible, and these drivers are able to transfer those skills that they've learned on simulators onto the track, but actually adapt to the track then very quickly.
And to talk about the rest of qualifying, as far as it really went, it did show that the Mercedes, the entire package, be it in the dry, be it in the wet, everyone with a Mercedes engine, but particularly the works team as AMG Mercedes themselves, seem to be in a completely different league to the rest of the field.
Yeah, they've got their engine definitely dialed in for sure. The aero apparently is still questionable. A lot of people are saying that the Merc doesn't actually look that great through the corners, but they've got the engine so dialed in, it's actually not making that much of a difference. So, yes, the Mercedes is working well, but you've got to think when the Renault engine is sorted, and if the Red Bull is currently quicker throughout the corners, that they will come up. McLaren also, you have to think the same sort of thing. And I don't believe we saw the best at all from the Williams, considering Bottas hit the wall, pitted, came back out, and actually drove his way back up to sixth position, which I guess now has turned into fifth. That's pretty phenomenal. And you've got to wonder what Massa would have done as well if he hadn't been taken out by Kobayashi.
And to go to that first corner, it really was a brake failure as far as Kobayashi was concerned, but Raikkonen very lucky not to be taken out in that incident, which eventually collected Kobayashi and also Felipe Massa in that second Williams.
Well, just what you said before about the front of the catering room as well, you've got to wonder how much damage would have been done to the rear suspension of Raikkonen's car. Apparently, nothing. Unless those braking problems came later on through the suspension issue. but it seemed it was all right in the first few laps, and he was able to continue and make it to the end. But yeah, that was a pretty hefty hit. Kobayashi hit him before he went into Massa.
And as far as that actual start went itself, Hamilton, we found out a couple of laps later why, had a horrible start. Vettel had a horrible start. However, two guys who had amazing starts. The guy starting in the 3rd position, and also you had Magnussen as well, getting phenomenal starts. And Rosberg, that was something that we very rarely see from anyone apart from Alonso.
Well, exactly. Rosberg's start was flawless. It was absolutely phenomenal to car through 2 cars and be clear. That was the big thing as well. He was clear by turn 1. And, he just basically drove off into the distance. And he was superb. He really was absolutely superb. Kevin Magnussen, though, great launch off the line, but then that huge wheel spin, nearly firing me into the wall. Tremendous reactions to save the car and hold his position and get into a nice little scrap then for a couple of laps before it all settled down. But Magnussen showing that he had absolutely no fit. The kid has been walking around with the most amount of confidence I think I've ever seen from any driver on debut. He was so calm and relaxed, and he put that into the race as well.
He reminded me of a young Kimi Räikkönen and a young Felipe Massa. Now, he's not making the same mistakes that Felipe Massa made at the start of his career, but had that pure driving ability of Massa, but he had that calmness of Kimi Räikkönen. And I remember back in 2001, he had that issue in qualifying, and it's like, what happened in his interview? As cool and calm as Kimi is today. Well, I went onto the gas, I got the puncher, what am I supposed to do? And then he had that amazing charge through the field in his debut Grand Prix, getting a point which was back then in the Sauber days. Really, Magnussen has got that, how do I say, that drive, or someone that you can see in the next 4 or 5 years being a world champion.
4 or 5 years, but I tell you what, if he carries on the way he is, and McLaren sort of get a bit more downforce in the car, there's nothing to stop him from this year, because the confidence he possesses, and I don't think he'd make the same sort of mistakes that Hamilton would make, for example, like he did in the Chinese Grand Prix in 2007. So there's nothing stopping him from doing it this year, and McLaren are capable of delivering the car. With Ron Dennis there, they're going to have plenty of drive behind that team. So it's not completely out of the question that it happens this year, but I think McLaren do need to improve their car a little more so before they start challenging the Mercs and possibly even the Red Bull. But yeah, it's looking promising for Magnussen and McLaren, even if I prefer Magnussen not to be in McLaren personally, because I'm not a big McLaren fan.
And there are a couple of issues as far as McLaren go. The first one is the fact that they ran this special livery at Australia, which seemed to be telling for me that they only really had one big sponsor in Mobile One. Now, chances are, after the performance they had today, they might get some more sponsorships in time for Malaysia. However, this is also their last year of Mercedes power, and people need to remember that, because next year they go to Honda, coming back into Formula One, and Honda has got a good pedigree. They've been running with very similar engines, which arguably has got to be stressed, yes, in different ways, more in the IndyCar series right now, but Honda are coming back, and Mercedes as an engine manufacturer won't want to give too much information to McLaren, so really McLaren are a pure customer team right now, especially as far as how much technical support they're going to get.
Well, yes, you've got to believe that the Mercedes in the Mercedes car is probably a slightly, say, B-spec engine, where everyone else has got the A-spec engine, you would believe. With Honda coming back there in next year, you would think they may take the baseline of the IndyCar engine, whack on the various kinetic and turbo recovery systems, and make it rev up to 15,000 RPM. It's not completely beyond the question, but I tell you what, they've got plenty of dyno testing for it already. So you do wonder, how well their engine will start next year. But McLaren will be on the back foot more so because they are moving away, and the other teams are likely to keep the Mercedes engines within their cars. Are probably going to get the B-spec engine first before maybe McLaren do, especially if they start challenging Mercedes as well for race wins.
Indeed, and as far as Honda IndyCar Formula One partnership goes, this isn't like 10 years ago with Chevrolet and Toyota, where the IndyCar series ran purely on ovals. These days, IndyCar does run on road courses, and quite heavily on road courses. In fact, it's now more a road series than it is an oval series. And yes, they're not running at the pure speed of Formula One. They haven't got an 8-speed gearbox, etc. However, it's a lot more similar than it was 10 years ago. And it will be interesting to see how well Honda do, because if it works well there, you've got a very easy potential way of maybe engine suppliers from Formula One circumventing the engine rules to go and try things out in IndyCar, and vice versa. You've got the idea of potentially having Chevrolet come back into Formula One if it all goes well for Honda.
Well, it will start creating avenues for manufacturers. I mean, just the other day, Porsche came out and said, you know, if they weren't allowed by the VAG group to go up against Audi at Le Mans, Porsche would have entered Formula One with these current spec engines. And you got to remember, even though Mark Webber has now moved from Red Bull into a Le Mans program with Porsche, it is a V6 engine. They are using a V6 engine that will be still petrol, and they will have various engine recovery systems on that car to run at Le Mans. So will the LMP engines also be an element of pickup put into a Formula One car and still potentially work? There's a lot of crossover between these manufacturers that you may get, such as Chevrolet and Honda maybe coming in from IndyCar and going into Formula One, and then Porsche from the other side coming in as well. There was a lot of speculation that Ferrari were going to go to LMP racing as well, pick up their engine, put it in an LMP1 car. There could be a lot of crossover between the categories in the next few years, and I think the only thing that will dictate then the difference will be quite simply the downforce levels, and also the IndyCar run at, correct me if I'm wrong, correct me here, Will, but is it 10,000 RPM they run at?
Yes, they run it slightly less, around 10,000, 10,500, depending on the boost levels. And again, depending on the track they're running at, they run slightly higher spec at Indy. But still, it's one of those things that the Ferrari thing, I know someone who used to work at Ferrari, and he was telling me exactly this. In fact, he was telling me this 6 months before Ferrari even mentioned it, that, you know, the way they've designed the engines these days and the similarities more between the WEC and Formula One right now means that you've got the better transferability between it. Of course, then you've got to find a team to try and potentially run both. And I think long term, with the ideas of the new USF1, with, I believe it's Joe Gibbs Racing involved. No, sorry, Haas Racing. So it'll be Haas trying to come into Formula One. Then also,
next year.
Yeah, then also you've got potentially things like the Muscle Milk LMP team looking to try and expand their avenues. We are in an era right now where the lines between people just running in one form of motorsport, and remember also that we are kind of out an economic downturn now. There is more money available, more money for innovation, and the car manufacturers want to get back into racing generally.
Well, they do. We are starting to see, the increased rate coming out of a recession. Britain was just said the other day that, they've taken their first step. It's a good step. While it's not a great step, it is a good step forwards out of a recession. The car industry was one of the biggest hits, even though it never should have been. It's one of the biggest industries that was hit, and we did lose various teams and manufacturers along the way, but slowly are starting to come back, the ones that were able to keep themselves stable. And we are starting to see teams come back up and manufacturers come back in, especially in this era where turbochargers and kinetic energy systems and electric systems and hybrid systems are being introduced into road-going cars, and they will be stress tested within the racing scenes around the world, whether it be WEC, Formula One, or IndyCar, to make them road relevant. And I think the crossover between the two, the categories, will actually help those manufacturers grow. Toyota is still one of the biggest in the world, in manufacturers in the world, and they're still going to Le Mans. I still believe one day Peugeot will turn back up in LMP1 racing as well. I know they've got a couple of rally cars going at the moment, but there's nothing to stop them.
And then also it might allow a return back to Formula One for a team that really only ever ran with Prost in the end. To go back to the race, however, there's two big stories to start the race early. Lewis Hamilton. Now, we expected that there was something wrong with Lewis at the very start of the Grand Prix, because for a car that got pole position in emphatic fashion, that car didn't get off the line, didn't run well in those first couple of laps, and you were always thinking, it's happening to Hamilton again, that bad luck.
Yeah, there was something definitely wrong with the car at the start. You could hear it within the engine, but then we also found out on the installation lap when he went round and came round to the grid that there was something wrong with it. Vettel in contrast had it happened actually on the first lap. But yeah, apparently Hamilton started a lot earlier. And it is unlucky. But, it goes to show that then the other car and the other driver, that the reliability is there when it does work. So, and it has been Hamilton's car all weekend. Obviously, he was the first man out on Friday and broke down on that first lap as well.
Yep. And to come back to one of the other potential issues as far as, old drivers, new drivers go, there's a different clutch release system, it seems, as well for this season. And the clutch is such an integral part of an F1 car. Not just for getting off the line, but when you are sat on that grid, that initial launch is so stressful on these engines, even on that parade lap, and then on that aborted start, when they've got their clutch into gear. I've got a feeling that actually happened around that time. It just worsened the situation, and some of the established drivers, they get into a mode where they just think they know what they're doing. That potentially could have caused an issue in both either Vettel or Hamilton.
Very true. 4 times the torque going through the engine and through the chassis as well that they have to compensate for. And it could just be simply a case of that those drivers still thought it was last year's cars and put too much through it and too much stress through it. But clearly, once it's done properly, you get a start like Rosberg gets.
Yeah. And Sebastian Vettel as well, he had a number of issues in the race. His as well, it did seem to be that on the start he was questioning Rocky as to why something wasn't showing up on his dash, why he wasn't getting any power from the electric kinetic engine park. But he wasn't a happy bunny in the race at all. You could hear him, and we never see Vettel that angry over the team radio.
I don't think he's been happy all weekend, to be honest with you. He didn't seem all that interested coming into the weekend. He seemed heavily disheartened even from winter testing, whereas Ricciardo's kind of more so got on with the job. But yeah, to hear him quite so flustered and quite so angry and so vocal throughout the race and basically shouting at Rocky and to the team, it's very un-Vettel in what we're used to over the past few years. And you question just sort of where the temperament's at. He's had it his way for the last few years. And will his mental strength be really tested this year? Where Ricciardo really doesn't have any pressure. Everyone expects him to get absolutely trounced by Sebastian Vettel. He comes into a team essentially going to be the number 2 driver with no pressure. And he's literally just driving for him. And that pressure being lifted is ultimately, for a guy that's just coming into a top team such as Red Bull, is only going to help.
And as far as that number 2 driver goes, it's a very big rumour, shall we say, that, but Vettel kind of vetoed Kimi Räikkönen moving to Red Bull in favour of Ricciardo. And it does make sense in such a way. If you get a number 1 driver, the last thing you want is someone who would really put pressure on your career. And I know a number of very good Formula 1 drivers. I think the one who's most historic for me was Giancarlo Fisichella. Always beat his teammates right his Formula 1 career. Ralf Schumacher, Alexander Wurz, Jenson Button. Then he got Fernando Alonso as his co-driver. Trounced him, and it was Fisichella's career over. And I think that Vettel was worried about that in some ways. And you're right as well. Ricciardo really hasn't got, the pressures of being a number 2 driver on him. All he needs to do really is perform on the day and get results like what he almost had. But for Vettel, I always think, in times of adversity, how drivers behave more than when they're winning championships. Because we saw Hakkinen go for a very dry spell in 2001, and he wasn't too unhappy. He was trying to be calm about it. Schumacher, again, he wasn't too angry about it. But Alonso, the second that Alonso wasn't winning, he turned vicious and ended up, of course, leaving Renault, then went to McLaren, and left McLaren, went to Ferrari. So you've got to argue that Red Bull and Vettel, that relationship can become very strained very quickly, despite the fact that Vettel is the golden boy.
It can become quite volatile quite quickly. Yeah, most definitely. And that's one of the things I think will develop over the season, especially if Ricciardo is consistent and beats him in the first half of the season. We know how good Vettel is in the second half and how to put a championship together, but if Ricciardo can take points and good, solid, consistent points in the first half of the season and really mount pressure on, because remember, Red Bull, well, Vettel has never had really an outright challenge from his own teammate. It's always been from other teams. Therefore, he's been able to push his team and himself further. But if it comes within within his own team, that's going to be a whole different story. You're speaking about veto in drivers. I remember it was Alain Prost also vetoed Ayrton Senna. I think it was Senna joining a
Senna
team,
Ferrari,
or Mansell.
I think it was either Senna to Ferrari or Mansell back to Ferrari. You're right.
Yeah,
it was
one of
Mansell
those.
back
But
to Williams. That was the one.
Yeah, Mansell back to Williams. That's the one, and he vetoed that, but it's because he wanted to still be the lead driver as such. But as we later found out through some great documentaries that Sky Sports have been doing, that was simply down to history and how he'd been treated previously in history, and why he did it. It wasn't so much out of spite; it was more so the problems within the team atmosphere that he did it. But not really the point in modern F1, and I think they have to adapt. And Ferrari have taken a huge risk in taking Alonso and Raikkonen, and it's interesting. It's only for a year.
Yeah.
Because obviously the one big thing still is the fact that there is that door slightly open for Vettel to go to Ferrari eventually.
And again, depending on how Red Bull does this year, and depending on how Ferrari does this year, that could become more of a possibility than what we're talking about right now. And you talk about those historic team battles. Of course, the latest one of them is Alonso and Hamilton back in 2007. And we don't often get it these days, but as far as Red Bull goes, are we going to be in a situation, you think, this year when we're going to have more multi-21 dramas?
Possibly. I think due to the cars and their nature, we may not see such hard battling yet because they'll still be learning and understanding the cars. I don't truly believe we will see the drivers and the teams maximise these cars until the second half of the season. I don't think we'll see... Because one big thing I noticed, especially in qualifying, is that even though the qualifying times were still pretty good and pretty representative, they were keeping away from the curbs. There was a lot of avoiding curbs, and that was kind of very unusual of F1, where they try and, of any race car driver, if you like, and they try and capitalise with all the track, but they were keeping away from the curbs. So they're still worried about a few things. And I think that progression, and with progression comes aggression, is to see how a driver and team can develop to the point where they blend the two together, where they can understand how to drive the car and also keep the car reliable and stable.
Now, it's one of the things that I've heard throughout the BBC broadcast, Sky Sports F1 broadcast, the NBC Sports Network broadcast, that the guys are having to drive the car differently this year as well. And we have seen that the lines that we've been taking previously at Albert Park have been completely different this year. And also, Turn 1 has been a lot more difficult for drivers than I think since about 2007, 2008.
It's funny, actually. The corners are actually looking like corners rather than straight lines now, because of obviously the grip and the traction and the downforce that they've previously had. They've been that easy. It's not really much come from it, but now they're looking like real corners, especially what you said with Turn 1. Turn 4, Turn 9, Turn 13... No, Turn 12, sorry. So there's a few corners that were in particular that they were getting caught out by. And driving style is one big thing. And Will, I've got this question for you because you know probably better than anyone when it comes to IndyCar. But when they talk about this fuel saving and this fuel economy, I mean the IndyCar boys and the Champ Car drivers. Bourdais is the first one that comes to mind. He was always renowned to be still being quick, yet fuel saving. And Will Power is the same now. Dario was the same. Just think if they happen to do that sort of driving style and the nature of these cars, some of the IndyCar guys, and even before that with Champ Car, they've been doing it for years. I wonder what they could actually do in a Formula One car now.
Yeah, back in the, I'm going to give it its full title, the Bridgestone presents the Champ Car World Series powered by Ford. Bourdais was just in a class of his own. And again, in IndyCar, you had Dario Franchitti, Scott Dixon, Will Power, most probably historically, and a couple of other drivers as well. Charlie Kimball, back at Mid-Ohio last year, did it phenomenally. And for a while in IndyCar, almost every single race was a fuel mileage race. That's not as much the case this year last year, because they kind of sorted out the race distances, so it didn't become that. But it was for a long time. You had to do it with your right foot as well, because at the end of the 2009 IndyCar season, they got rid of the fuel mix. So it's something that you had to do with your right foot and your right foot alone. And I would love to see Scott Dixon, Will Power, Sebastian Bourdais, all in a modern Formula One car. I think it could be phenomenal to see. And the unfortunate thing is, your chances are you won't. We've got one IndyCar driver right now, and Simona Di Silvestro, who is testing for Sauber with possibly an eye into 2015, which will be great for the sport. And Simona was also one of those drivers who could do the fuel saving, yet still be fast. So, one to watch there, Nick, for 2015, Simona Di Silvestro.
I tell you what, that is one. I never thought about that, but yeah, that is very true. Simone Di Silvestro, and obviously having the experience of the IndyCar and these generation of Formula One cars, and while they do have more power, more kinetic energy, and while they have the more hybrid systems within them, the driving style and technique we can only go off what the drivers say. This is pure interpretation, but the interpretation you get from them. The first thing I thought of was IndyCar and the way that they drive the IndyCars and the fuel-saving techniques that they do. Lift early, brake later into the corner. Bourdais, Franchitti, Will Power, these guys have been doing it for years. And if Simona has that experience and can adapt to the G-force levels and the power of the cars, that experience is going to pay off so much. And 2015 may be her chance.
And it'll be the first Formula One driver who is female in Formula One, I think, since 1990. Of course, the one that Bernie Eccleston was trying to get was a GoDaddy driver by the name of Danica Patrick in the US F1 team. That never happened. But overall, a female driver in Formula One, it has been too long now. And of course, you've got Susie Wolff in the Williams reserve seat as well, who seems to be another amazing talent who really could, help shake up Formula One a bit.
Amazing talent. She's got talent. But I just don't think she's quite the level for Formula One. She does a good. This going to sound harsh, but she does a good PR job more than anything. I think Simona is the real hardcore driver that you'll see take on. Susie had a stint in DTM. She was okay, nothing really special, but Simona really lit up the IndyCar field and the IndyCar scene. And I think that is the real female driver that you may see come through. And I think she will be the driver that people will be looking towards on the female side rather than Susie Wolff. Even though Susie Wolff does have a FP1 outing, I believe it is, at Silverstone.
Yes. And you've got to make that case always there, because you think about female drivers in motorsports, period, and there is still a bit of a dark cloud thinking, well, you're only here because you got the sponsorship money or the publicity, so on and so forth. And I think that Formula One has been correctly cautious about it, bringing back a female driver because she's a good driver and can actually compete with the other 23 cars on the grid, not just because she's a woman or a token woman or just a moving billboard.
Yeah, that's very true. You know, they're not doing it for publicity or financial reasons. They're doing it because she would need to be a good driver, and I think Simona fits that bill very well.
Right, back to the racing at Australia. And we talked about Kimi Räikkönen earlier on. He was rather annoyed in the press conferences that I saw both on NBCSN and on Sky Sports F1. He wasn't happy with the new braking system at all. The thing is with Kimi is he has the meh face, but then also he has the kind of really annoyed face. You never see Kimi Räikkönen smiling, but you can tell when he's upset, and he was upset today.
He was very upset. He did not like the way the car was driving at all. I remember when he first came back into Formula One, the first thing he identified wrong with the Lotus was the power steering system. He got out of the car after a few laps and was like, "Yep, that's wrong with it. This is wrong with it." I remember that he was drafted in to drive the GP3 car, I believe, to help develop that car for this season. To help them understand what's required and what is needed. And, considering it is for this season as well, he steps into that car after a few laps, told them what was wrong with it. So he can identify what is wrong with the car quite quickly and quite easily. And clearly there was definitely something wrong with his car today and did not have faith, especially under braking. And it's going to take a little bit of time. It's either going to need Kimi to adapt, which we also already seen. Kimi's not one really for adapting. He more wants the car for his liking. Whereas Fernando can drive around problems more so and make the car look better than what it actually is.
Even Alonso did struggle quite a bit, though. I mean, this isn't the Fernando Alonso who we know in some ways, who is just incredibly fast and can make a car work for him. Yes, he came home in what is now 4th position, but he was outdriven today by quite a number of drivers, and that Ferrari, even on Alonso, didn't look as if it was planted on the racetrack.
No, it doesn't look necessarily bad. It doesn't look like it's a bad car. It just doesn't look stable, and I think they're having this issue with the engine basically dumping fuel for fun, and it not being very fuel efficient. So I think they have problems with fuel, but I don't think they actually have what they need in terms of the actual reliability of the car and the drivability of the car yet. That looks like it's still to come with Ferrari, but I would say they have a good base that they can work with for 2014, and they're probably in a better position than they have in the past few years. It's just a question if they can get that engine right.
And Ferrari have historically been slow starters as well. That if you have a look at the middle part of the season, that is where generally Ferrari shine. And it's kind of ironic because they kind of get it together by 2/3 into the season, but by that point it's too late. But they carry on for that season, which is then taking their development of time away from getting a car which works well at the beginning of the next season. And I think Ferrari's been stuck in a rut for quite a while now as far as that goes.
Yeah, and they've stuck. Well, they had a big change. Was it 2010 when Alonso didn't win a title and he couldn't get past the Renault at the time? And they had a change then, and it was kind of more like a structural change rather than a wholesale change. And I do believe that is the part that needs to be done. And you've got to wonder if Dominicali's the right person to take the team forwards. So yeah, I think they're kind of. I do believe there's sort of like a biding their time before Vettel comes in, before they do make a big change. But yeah, Ferrari are definitely. They are stuck. Unless something dramatic happens and Alonso starts pulling off some fantastic things and Raikkonen picking up some good points, I don't really see much change happening yet. There's too much politics in the background.
Now, one guy who had an almost perfect race was Valtteri Bottas in that Williams. And I say almost because he was the reason for the one and only safety car by climbing the wall out of the second chicane. Now, he was incredibly lucky in some ways that there wasn't more damage done to that car, and they did allude to it on the broadcast that he was very lucky that the wheel actually just came away from the car, because we've seen it so many times before that you get a puncture and that tyre just flailing around just destroys the side part of the bodywork.
Well, yeah, it does usually destroy the entire side of it, really. And he got lucky the fact that it didn't almost shear across; it went outwards more so. So he did get lucky with it, but good recovery, more than anything, to be honest with you.
And then that drive back through the field, this was pure aggression and speed from Valtteri Bottas in a great performance by him. In fact, he made a rather interesting move around the outside of Kimi Räikkönen as well, and I don't see many passes at that corner in the same way that he made one over Kimi.
Yeah, that was pretty spectacular, and considering Bottas had that issue, well, he made the issue himself, really. But to recover it in the way that he did, and to come back through the field the way he did, I think it shows strength of mind and character that he has. He got the sort of drive to push himself forwards to succeed this season. But it also shows, personally, that I do still believe that Williams is probably the second best car. And if he was able to negotiate those few drivers, and I reckon he would have caught up to the McLarens and then Ricciardo pretty quickly. Because I do believe that Williams is quick. It doesn't look good in the wet, though. Doesn't look good in the wet.
It doesn't. And perhaps the best thing that Williams have done in 7-8 years is go to a power plant, which is well established and works well in Mercedes. They get themselves a new sponsor with Martini, so there's some good money back in that team, finally. And it means that they don't have to deal with pay drivers either, which is another important thing for long-term legitimacy for that team. But you're right. I think Williams, it's a close fight right now, in my opinion, between McLaren, Williams, Force India, and Red Bull for the second best team in Formula One. But Williams are a definite shout. And as far as that drive and that determination goes, what Bottas has done is something that not a lot of drivers always are good at. And that is just putting an incident behind them and, just getting on with it. And I think the perfect polar opposite to that was always Mika Häkkinen. Yes, I will just stick with Finnish drivers here, but Mika Häkkinen, whenever he had a bad race, he would just kind of switch off, and that would be it, game over. And I remember there was a number of races back in his 2 championship years, 98, but more particularly in 99, if he had a bad moment, that would be it, and he would just decline from there. Whereas Bottas, he took that incident as a positive in some ways. Like, okay, I know what I can achieve, let's go on and get it.
Yeah, strength of character was tremendous within Bottas, and he clearly has belief and faith within himself and in the car, because he creating that accident and the instant, he was just like, no, doesn't matter, I can still do it. And he actually said when he was overtaking cars, he could see the difference between the Renault-powered, Ferrari-powered, and the Mercedes-powered cars. I think the most difficult one he had to negotiate possibly was Nico Hülkenberg, and he had to use a full batch of DRS for it to get past a fellow Mercedes runner, but the rest of them, he was just breezing by them.
Yeah, completely. And that's one of the big things, I think, the stories for this season, because historically, the Mercedes engine has been the fastest in a straight line, but it's always been the Red Bulls who's been more efficient when it comes to downforce usage. Now, we've had, 30% of downforce taken away for 2014, and not only that, but Red Bull historically packaged their cars really tightly, and they've kind of had to undo a little bit of that because of the issues that they had in pre-season testing, and we'll talk about the effects of that to Malaysia just a little bit. But it does seem to be right now that Mercedes, McLaren, Force India, they have the entire package, whereas the Renault engines, they don't have the straight line speed, but they haven't got that aerodynamic dependency to fall back on.
No, they don't have. They obviously those cars do have the aerodynamic packages around them, but I think the way they're now packaged together, I don't think helps. And with the engine and the various systems that go around them now, it's more how it's packaged and structured together, rather than be reliant on the downforce, and especially things like blown diffusers as well. There's none of that anymore that you can rely on. And one big thing for Vettel as well is that he was the master of understanding how the blown diffuser worked and how to generate the downforce through the rear of the car and push the car into the ground. And he's having to basically undo everything he's just learned for the past few years and go again, where the other drivers, A, never really understood how to maybe drive that way, and B, also never had the development like the Red Bull had in how to drive that way. So you've got drivers that were almost like in limbo, now learning a car that's different, whereas Vettel's essentially undoing everything he perfected.
And there's no way that Vettel can do that, even if there was, in some ways, a rear diffuser, because the way you drive a car now is completely different. And rather than it being off the gas pedal, slamming onto the brake pedal, you've got that bit in between, which you need for that kinetic energy system to, get that extra power when you need it. So it's a different way of driving, period. And I think the FIA, what they've done is a really good thing here to double close off that loophole with the blown diffusers.
Yes, I think that's a huge positive, massive positive. In fact, I mean that is one big thing that they needed to do, and they've done it. And I think it gets rid of essentially something that was quite manufactured in the fact that you could blow the floor, you could blow the diffuser. It's a clever concept, but it's not really needed. Let's be honest. And you get more the drivers being much more physical. I mean, the temperatures weren't exactly all that hot, but tell you what, some of those drivers did not look like they've had a workout after the race.
Oh yeah, and the ironic thing is that you've got a big hole now on the rear of the car with the exhaust and a big bulge at the front of the car. So there is so many jokes going around. In many ways, a number of people's joked why there's not an adult protection company or two protecting the front wing of the cars.
Well, Durex Racing maybe.
Durex Racing, there we are, McLaren, there's your new sponsor for this year. But we've got to talk about Ricciardo because, he had a second place finish. Before we get to the penalty, I don't think I've heard a crowd cheer as loud as those 20 seconds when Ricciardo had pole position provisionally and that second place finish today since the 1999 Italian Grand Prix when Mika Hakkinen spun out, which led to him, of course, crying behind the forest where the cameras saw, which he didn't think was going to be seen. I haven't seen a crowd cheer that loud in, 15 years now?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen it or heard a crowd go that mental. I mean, Hamilton and Button, when they've got pole or maybe a race winner at Silverstone's been pretty special, but I don't know, there was something about the Australian crowd today. They were so up for it, and they were just like, that's one over on Vettel as well. So that was a pretty special moment for qualifying, and then also with come the race as well when he got second place, and I'm just unfortunate that it's no longer at this point in time. It's gone. The Red Bull are protesting it, but it's a bit sad, really.
It is a bit sad, and before we get to that as well, the jeers and the cheers when Vettel didn't make it through to Q3. That was Australia saying to Vettel, we're not going to forget Moto 21 Gate.
That was the world saying that, I think, more so. I think the Australians just stood up and the world's kind of followed, if you like, other than the Vettel fans. I've never been the biggest Vettel fan, but I could certainly understand why people were doing it. Martin Brundle was quick enough to jump to Vettel's aid in stopping the jeers last year when they were booing him and all that, which you don't really want. Let's be honest, you don't want booing, but you can understand why the Australians did what they did at the same time.
Yeah, and I think Vettel, I say in many ways, you had a new favourite driver in Formula 1 for Kimi Räikkönen, perhaps Australia's second favourite racing driver when that yellow flag came out. And it's ironic that Kimi Räikkönen crashed and became a hero in Australia. But let's go to that penalty for Daniel Ricciardo, because I have got the rulebook in front of me. Took me a while to find it. But it's Article 5.1.4, and Article 5 is about the power unit. And it's specifically Article 5.1.4. Fuel mass flow must not exceed 100 kilograms per hour. And you've got a supplementary rule below that, which says that below 10,500 RPM, the fuel mass flow must not exceed Q kilograms per hour equals 0.009 N RPM plus 5.5. I have no idea what that bit is, but the simple one is Rule 5.1.4. And the ruling is specific there, and that it's not over the average over the race. It does seem to be at any point in the Grand Prix. It cannot exceed 100 kilograms per hour.
Yeah, from my understanding as well, it was the fuel sample that was given, the fact that they'd been using, I think you read it out before actually, possibly, but it was to do with the fact that they'd used different sensors or fuel samples in the first two parts of practice as well, that then went different come the race. And there was essentially saying, well, no, we used your original software, then we used ours, then we went back again. So it seems to be a breakdown in communication, and eventually the one they've used is one that was illegal.
It's a very messy situation as far as it goes, and I have got the ruling in front of me as well. And what essentially it was is that Red Bull started off with a sensor which they used in FP1 and FP2 for a number of runs, and then in their fourth run they were getting different readings to the first couple of times, and then they switched out the sensor. The FIA and the team wasn't happy about what they used in qualifying, so they asked them under parc fermé conditions, which the FIA can do, to essentially go back to what they had for FP1. However, what then happened is the technical representative for Red Bull essentially said that they were going to use a certain set of settings, which wasn't approved by the FIA, and even though they can use it, the FIA have the final call on that. And there is a ruling which states that if at any time we, as in the FIA, consider that the sensor has an issue which has not been detected by the system, we, aka the FIA, will communicate this to the team concerned and switch to a backup system. The backup system is the calculated fuel flow model with a correction factor decided by the FIA. And the technical representative observed throughout the telemetry during the race that the fuel flow was too high and contacted the team, giving them the opportunity to follow the previous instruction and reduce the fuel flow so that it was within the limit as measured by the homologated sensor, and thus give the team the opportunity to be within the compliance. The team chose not to make this correction. So it's a little bit more black and white than what Red Bull's been saying, in my opinion, that the FIA have clearly said something to Red Bull during the race. Red Bull chose not to basically play along.
Yeah, Red Bull will try and get around that by saying, well, you were informed and you probably knew about it already. That's probably what they'll try and throw back at them, but it's not really the point. And they I suppose in some respects they have a leg to stand on, but because the way the FIA have gone about it, they don't at the same time, because then you have to question, well, if that sensor was failing, well, what about the other sensor that was being used? And if you use that sensor, why do you not then use it in the race? Why do you use it in practice? So it's a very, very grey area. I got a feeling this will probably run this will probably run up all the way up to Malaysia before we probably know definitively who and what the final positions in Australia will be. But as it stands, he has been disqualified, which has bumped everyone up, which has put, Button onto the podium. Bottas has gone up to 5th, and it puts Perez into the points. Danny Kvyat, we've not even touched on him. It's the fact he's the youngest driver to score points on debut, and he's finished 9th.
Yeah, taking that record away from Sebastian Vettel in the process. Now, again, the Red Bull team are appealing this, so it will go to the FIA Court of Appeal. What's interesting to me is that in the FIA ruling, they did state that it was nothing to do with the driver, but they took away the driver's points. Now, there has been instances before, and I think it was BAR with their fuel gate, which was the issue, when they didn't penalise the drivers initially there. But the FIA Court of Appeal, it can be a messy place. Of course, you had the BAR incident. Then back in '99 at Malaysia, you had the Ferrari incident as well. And that went from one extreme to another back in '99. So there's a lot to be sorted out in the courtrooms. But at the end of the day, we hate it when you have to decide stuff in courtrooms.
Oh, it's the worst possible thing. You got debating things in courtrooms. It should all be decided on track there and then. And it's a sad state of affairs that it has to go that far as well. Do you blame the team? Do you blame the driver? It was on that specific car. Then you take the points off them. For me, when it comes to situations like that, Ricciardo's done nothing wrong himself. He's a driver. That should be a driver's points. Deduct the team's one okay because they were the ones that messed up. Maybe take the points that he got for third place. For second place off him there. To take 18 points off Red Bull. And don't really need to take them off him though, especially on his podium on debut for Red Bull at his home Grand Prix as well. It just leaves the FIA a little bit red-faced as well.
Yes.
It leaves a dampener on the sport as well in a time where they need all the positive media they can possibly get. It's because of this new era of Formula One and the engines, etc. as well. So it's just messy and was so unnecessary, really.
Now, the FIA will probably argue, well, at the end of the day, the driver benefited even if he wasn't privy to the information. And that kind of goes to what the whole Alonso thing was back in Singapore with the whole safety car thing. But in NASCAR, and we'll talk about NASCAR in a positive light for once here, in NASCAR they take away manufacturer's points and they put the crew chief, what will be in the technical representative in many ways, on probation. So it's something that sanctions the team and it doubly penalises the team rather than overly penalising the drivers. But you could argue, well, you don't need to tell Vettel anything when he's in, his last race of the season, and the team could do something that will, positively impact Vettel, and you're opening yourself up to a huge loophole at some point in the future. So, yes, I can understand where the FIA is coming to, but it does leave a sore taste in the mouth, especially when it's your hometown hero getting his first podium in Formula One on his home racetrack. Although, at least Ricciardo got to stand on the podium.
He did, and that is a positive thing. I think that's the most positive thing he can take. I think the other positive thing he can take is that he did do a better job than Vettel. He was positive, and he was essentially the guy that was second on the day. And he should not look at this negative side, but he should build on it and say, right, I'm going to get points in Malaysia.
And to talk about Malaysia, the hottest race of the season, the most humid race of the season, the most tough race as far as it goes on your car all season, be it brakes, be it cooling, be it engines, be it gearboxes. It's going to be, of all the races, if your car can survive here, then you can breathe a huge sigh of relief.
I'd agree. If the car reaches the end in Malaysia, considering the heat, considering the fuel, considering everything else that goes around it, you are going to have a promising season, and there will be races that will be hot, but I don't think you'll get the humidity factor with it. And yeah, you get Malaysia sorted, and you'll be looking good on the temperature basis. Obviously, you've had a bit of temperature running with Bahrain already, but Bahrain is, considering it's a country in the Middle East, it's still relatively cool compared to what it can get to. So they've had some warm weather running, but this is a huge test what they're going into now.
And in Bahrain, it's a dry heat, whereas in Malaysia, it's a very wet heat.
Yes.
And it's always difficult when you talk about temperature. Temperature is one thing in Formula One, but it's also that humidity, which is the big factor. But also, Malaysia, you talk about Spa, you talk about, in some ways, perhaps Australia being wet, and also Brazil with it being wet. And you think they're the races that you can have wet races, but really Malaysia, it's monsoon season over there right now, and Formula One deliberately moved the start time around so that it kind of avoided the majority of these monsoons for very good reason.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is obviously a lot of they get moved about a lot, really. The race itself in Malaysia, I mean, when it rains, it pours for one thing, and we could see cars essentially breaking down, and the race not even being completed. So there's so many factors to Malaysia actually that can happen, especially in the past few years. The weather being the biggest one. So I don't think we'll get the full broad spectrum of it until actually Sunday. And I think practice is going to be essentially a test session.
Yes, I completely agree on that one. And I think as far as the rain goes, most prolific for me still comes back to 2001, where the race started and everyone knew it was going to rain. They didn't expect it to rain as much as it did rain. And you saw both Ferraris go off, McLaren go off. Half the field actually went off within the first lap or so of it raining. But at the same time, when it stops raining at Malaysia, it dries out incredibly quickly. So, yes, the drivers got to do their job, but the drivers have to be brave. And the pit crews have to be brave at Malaysia, because one lap too long on the wrong set of tyres, it's race over.
Yeah, most definitely. Especially with these cars because the amount of torque that goes through them, even if you're on the wrong tyre for one lap, you're more likely to spin than in previous years. We saw how difficult it was for drivers in qualifying. Around a track like Malaysia as well, it's going to be even more of a challenge. They're going back to a full proper racetrack now as well, and they will attack a full proper racetrack in full racing conditions as well, where they haven't done that in pre-season. So a lot of the parts will get stressed again. You got a much longer straights as well. It's going to be a very, very interesting race in Malaysia. I think these first 4 flyaway races are going to be really very, very interesting to see how the teams and the drivers can react to these cars, and how fuel efficient they can get them as well within these first 4 races. Because when you get to places such as Spain, the fuel can go up. Then you got Monaco, which is probably one of the easier ones on fuel, but they're going to have to learn these cars so fast, and a lot of the teams playing catch up, especially Red Bull.
3 more points before we go off there. First one, you alluded to it very briefly, tyres. When the last couple of years we've seen drivers be aggressive on tyre choice in changing conditions, this time, do you think that you have to be more conservative on that tyre choice? Wait that extra lap from it being too greasy to it being just right to make that choice, that journey onto pit road, rather than trying to go that lap early and just trying to deal with it for a couple of laps?
Well, you could say that, but it's, Alonso, when he pitted, for example, wasn't that far off, but then also Button jumps a few other drivers, so it's a very tough one, in terms of the actual tyres themselves in dry conditions. And in wet conditions, I think the drivers are more likely to want to get onto those tyres as quick as possible because of the torque factor. So I think when it comes to tyres, I still believe they took the wrong tyres to Melbourne, really. I think they were too hard. They didn't really need them. And in some of those cars could have probably run the harder compound, the prime compound all day long, really.
It's kind of ironic. We've gone from a season when we were like, okay, these tyres are falling away too quickly, to all of a sudden complaining about Pirelli having tyres that are too conservative. If you're Paul Hendry, you can't
They went
win.
over conservative in the second half of last year, really, and they never looked back.
Yeah, if you're Paul Hendry, you're in a lose-lose situation, aren't you?
Well, you are, but the thing is that this is what's annoying about Formula 1 the past few years, because DRS, for example, was introduced to increase overtaking, but in a time where the tyres were going through a transition from Bridgestone to Pirelli. Pirelli made tyres that on some cars worked, some cars didn't, and you were able to get good drive-off corners to create overtaking opportunities anyway. So it's like, well, what's the need for DRS then? So where they make one change, they seem to make another change that they don't need. It's like they make 6 changes when they can make just one change and wait to see what happens that season. Because if that hadn't have happened and the DRS wasn't introduced and we did have the Pirelli tyres and the way the Pirelli tyres are, I still think that championship and that campaign would have been very, very good.
Yes, I will completely agree with you on that one. And it is in some ways helpful that we're not too reliant on tyres this year to be in the determining factor, that we can still place it in the hands of drivers. However, again, Pirelli, I don't envy Paul Hendry at all, or any of those people, because they are doing a very difficult job, and it does seem to be they have taken on a lot of feedback over the last 2 years or so. Now, final thoughts, really. You talk about the first couple of races, you talk about momentum. Right now, McLaren have that momentum, Mercedes have that momentum, Red Bull on the back foot, you've got Lotus on the back foot, you've got Williams, you've got and Force India really scrapping at the heels of some of these teams right now. How do you think it's going to shape out over these first couple of races? Is it going to be complete Mercedes domination, or will we get the Ferraris of the world coming back and the Renaults of the world coming back?
I think the Mercedes-powered, the Mercedes factory, if you like, the Mercedes factory, I do believe will be the team to beat in these first few races. And I do believe they will occupy the first and second steps on the podium most likely. But the battle behind, I think, is going to be hotly contested between McLaren, Williams and Force India, but I think it's more likely that the Force India will battle the Ferrari, whereas the McLaren and the Williams will be battling for the final step of the podium.
And if you were to grade today's race out of 10, what would you give it?
6.
6. You know what? I was giving them a 7 for effort because it had everything over this weekend. But I'll meet you halfway. I'm going to go to a 6.5.
Okay.
Just before we go, a couple of other things that came to light after the race were a lot of things were changed between the cars from qualifying to the race. On the number 1 car, you had some gear synchronization things, the 3 car engine heat shield, fuel flow meter we know about, front brake friction material. The Mercedes had some things changed on both its cars, the Ferraris had some things changed on both its cars. Do you think the FIA are just being lenient early on in the season and not wanting to be in a position with egg on their faces when you have 6 cars finished and just letting people change things to an extent?
Well, they've got to go careful because they could, it could be double standards here, if you like, because they were going to give absolutely no leniency on fuel, but yet they're willing to be lenient on essentially breaking parc fermé rules. So, yeah, they've got to go careful on where they draw the line here because they have to draw it fully under everyone, or they're going to say, "Oh, go on, I'll let you have that one for this race." But they were quick enough to jump on and say, "No, we are sticking by this fuel regulation rule." Well, hang on a minute. There's a few other things that have been broken by some other teams in some other areas, and parc fermé has quite clearly been broken. The cars have been changed and tampered with. So there's nothing saying actually the FIA won't penalise these guys going into Malaysia and actually for Malaysia yet as well.
True. Although for Kimi Raikkonen's car, one thing is a little bit confusing. Air horn replaced.
Yeah. If anyone's able to look at that, or anyone is able to view it, I put it on my Facebook and I'll put it up on Twitter in a bit as well. But it says air horn. Now, if Kimi was driving around with an air horn and no one saw it, then I'm greatly disappointed. But if that is part of the car and they call it an air horn, I'd like to know what part of the car that is, because that is awesome.
You could just imagine Kimi Raikkonen gets blocked by someone, he gets past, and he just goes, "Get out of my way, I know what I'm doing."
Mario Kart.
Yes. Oh, Kimi Raikkonen and an air horn. If you do know, let us know. And finally, we talked about this at the top of the show. It wasn't the most exciting race going, but final question. Malaysian Grand Prix in 2 weeks' time and the first IndyCar race of the season at St. Petersburg. Which do you think will be the better race?
The better race? The IndyCar one. I think the IndyCar one is... I can't wait for the IndyCar season. I'll be honest, I've become an IndyCar fan over the past few years. Well, and I was a kart fan as well, and I really kind of grew to IndyCar and Champ Car as well, and I did like the American scene. It went through a bit of a dull phase, if you like, in the past couple of seasons. But the driving standard was hideous at one point.
You had Milkaduno, what can you say?
I mean, I remember one race where I sat down with my brother, and my brother walked out the room. He said, "This is just not even comparing to what we just watched in the Formula One." I was like, "All right, Tom, I'll see you later." But I am very much looking forward to this season in IndyCar. I think in terms of intrigue and interest, I still think that will hold in Formula One. But in terms of racing spectacle, I think the IndyCar might just edge it. And I really do think the IndyCar is starting to get their act together. That Verizon deal is massive.
That Verizon deal is huge, and I know for saying quite a lot of things about IndyCar, and I kind of laughed about the fact they had iZod sponsorship, because no one knows who iZod is. Everyone knows who Verizon is, even when you're not living in the US, and IndyCar, well done. But of course, we have got a Grand Prix going on in a couple of weeks' time as well, and it is at the Sepang circuit in Kuala Lumpur. We are really looking forward to that race. It can be hot, it can be humid, it could also be incredibly wet. The one thing with Malaysia is you never, ever know. We'll be back for episode 2 of It's Just Another Grand Prix podcast in 2 weeks' time, the 30th of March, after the race from the Malaysian Grand Prix. Will it be Mercedes on the top step of the podium again? Will Red Bull win their appeal? Can the Renault cars get their act together? Can Ferrari get back to the top step of the rostrum? There's so many unanswered questions. And of course, you've got that great battle right now between McLaren, Force India and Williams. It really is, in some ways, a great season in the Formula 1 World Championship. And I tell you what, there is some great racing up and down the field. We will see you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks for listening. This has been episode 1 of just another Grand Prix podcast with myself, Will Vincent, and Nick Rowland. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
See ya.